And I want to begin by introducing Professor Eddie Glaude. Professor Eddie Glaude is a graduate of Morehouse College, received his Master's of Art from Temple University and his PhD in religion from Princeton University, where he studied under the tutelage of Cornel West. Eddie Glaude perhaps came to the attention of many individuals a couple of years ago when he had the audacity to pen an article for the Huffington Post that said, yes, the black church is dead. But I saw that as a challenge to the church, and we need more prophetic voices to challenge the historical black church to do more in this day and time. Please help me in welcoming to the table Professor Eddie Glaude. The next panelist I want to introduce to you is Ms. Angela Rada. She's a principal at Impact Strategies. She's originally from Seattle, Washington, and most recently was the General Counsel of Congressional Black Caucus. Her name appears on many lists as someone to watch. You may have seen her on MSNBC, on BET, or C-SPAN, but one thing is for sure, she is someone bent on making a difference in this world. Please welcome Ms. Angela Rada. If you ever find yourself in deep and need an attorney, you need to contact Ronald S. Sullivan Jr. Mr. Sullivan is a graduate of Morehouse College. He received his law degree from Harvard. For many years, he was the Director of the Health and Defender Service of Washington, D.C. There he has the honor, his cases were argued so well that in his tenure at PDS, he never ever lost a rape case. He also had the distinction of representing one of the members of Jenna 6. Please welcome back to Shiloh, Professor Ronald Sullivan. Someone is back home. That's in the person of Clinton Yates. He's the first person I read in the morning. I look for his tweets and his column, and he is an informed brother. I want you to know that I searched all over the internet looking for his extensive bio. But he made sure that his bio on the internet is kept to 3 sentences. With the first being that he was born at GW Hospital the week before Ronald Reagan ended up there for the wrong reasons. So please help me to welcome the coolest brother right in D.C. for the Clinton Yates. And I'm going to introduce our next person by running out the door because she has told me that she does not like long introductions. Well, she doesn't like long introductions. She never should have gone to the University of Virginia Law School. Never should have been the president, director counsel, or NAACP legal defense fund. If she doesn't like being talked about in public, then perhaps she should just settle for a nice, quiet life in some corporate law firm. But you all know her. So let me introduce her by just saying her name, Miss Elaine Jones.
Shiloh friends, thank you so much for coming out this evening. Pastor Smith, Mrs. Smith, and our illustrious panelists. Aren't they something? Let's give them a hand. Now, I promised them and I promise you that you're not going to hear much from me. You've heard from me in the past. Tonight, we're going to hear from them. All right? And so first, what I'm going to ask you to do, we've got a big topic. Although we've been talking primarily about Trayvon Martin, the topic says race and democracy in America. I mean, that's big. I mean, I don't know how we do that in an hour. Well, we're not going to take a big piece of what we're going to do. Is just, when we talk about race, for the purposes of this discussion, we talk about black folks in America. We're going to talk, that's what we're going to do. I mean, there are all other races. But we got to zero in on some issue to make the next 40, 45 minutes as productive as we can make it. All right, now, what I want the panelists to do first, because we've got politics and government represented, we've got religion represented, and African American studies, we have got law represented, and we've got journalism and the media represented. So we've got most of the bases covered. And so what I want them to do first is give us the 3-minute spiel in which they introduce themselves to you. One click to make sure he didn't do online. The 3 minutes as to what has motivated them to do what it is they do the way they do it. Because they're here because they're distinctive. You know, they understand and have studied and worked with and care about this issue we're talking about tonight, race and democracy. So let's start with who wants to go first. I'm going to let you volunteer, or should I just go ahead and exercise the prerogative of the chair, and I will do that, and I will, oh, okay.
How you doing, everybody? I just want to start off with letting everybody know that I was actually baptized in this church in 1988. So,
that's good.
I guess the way that I got here was by being somewhat of a contrarian. I start that by saying my 2 main points are by fighting back on things that people presume are just reasonable because it's what they've thought their whole lives and it's the way that everybody taught them how to do something. And I'll just start that, I guess, by saying 2 things in somewhat of opposition of things that were said here earlier. I don't just look at race as something that is black versus white. I think that as a human being, it is important to look at why all of us think what we do think about each other, because at the end of the day, that is what is most important. There are more than just 2 races living in this city, in this state, on this globe, and likely on your block. So that's something to pay attention to. That's number 1. And number 2, the other way that I got here is by making sure that I judged everybody for who they were for themselves. I've never told anybody to pull their pants up because I know that who they are on the inside is a lot more than just how they wear their clothes on the outside. And that's something that I think is very important to keep in mind here. And that's pretty much what I have to say about that.
Great, so again, I'm Ron Sullivan. So the way I got here, I'm a professor of law at Harvard Law School, and I direct at Harvard something called the Criminal Justice Institute. So my scholarship is in criminal law, and I look at these issues almost every day of my life. And apparently, is that a signal for me to stop already? My basic point in looking at the Trayvon Martin verdict is this, and I hope to be able to expand on it later, is that the problem with the verdict predated both the trial and the verdict itself. The problem was that progressive thinkers and political activists did not effectively go out and protest a set of laws that conspired to make this verdict possible. So the concealed weapons law and the so-called stand your ground laws in the state of Florida and 23 other states across the country made this verdict possible and, to my thinking, quite predictable. That is to say, the jury did what they were asked to do, hold the government to its burden of proving the case beyond reasonable doubt, and the government failed that miserably, in part because of the ways in which the law constrained what the jury could look at. Now, on top of that, there are a bunch of other complications in this case, the way in which race insinuates itself into almost every aspect of our lives, including the criminal justice system, and I hope we can discuss that. The data is unassailable, and even unassailable with respect to stand your ground law. Hopefully I'll say more about this later, but the race of the victim correlates with acquittal or conviction rates in a disturbing way. That is to say, black victims, if the victim is black, people are acquitted at an exponentially greater rate than if a victim is non-black.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening, Shiloh, and to all the guests who may not be members of Shiloh. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. I grew up in a household with a community activist, someone who took me to my first protest at the age of 2. No, I do not remember, but he reminds me daily. It was anti-apartheid protest, and I remember the chants of no justice, no peace, and other things that I can't say in church. I'll say, heck no, we won't go. What I will say is, as a result of the way in which I was raised, my trajectory is very much in alignment with the values that my parents taught me about justice and social justice being inextricably linked to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as a result of that, I think, sitting here before you all today, I would have the great fortune of not only having been raised that way, but then having the great privilege to work for the Congressional Black Caucus, known as the conscience of the Congress, for that same reason. These are ideals, whether we're talking apartheid or racial profiling or stand your ground or affirmative action, that they cling dear to, and as a result, I had the great opportunity to work for them. So today, now after having launched a movement with my nonprofit Impact, No Justice, No Sleep, you see the fun. But as a result of where we are today, the fact that in 2013 we have a black president now serving his second term, and in the mere fact that a black man could be, or a black boy could be shot in cold blood in 2013, until there's no justice, we won't sleep.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pastor Smith, Shiloh, and Brother Tom. Thank you for the opportunity to engage in this extraordinary moment in this dialogue. How did I arrive here? I want to imagine myself as a public intellectual who thinks seriously in public with others. And so I've committed myself to bringing to bear on major social issues my particular skill set, to think carefully in a time where seriousness is in abeyance, to exhibit the habits of reading and the discipline of mind in and around the subject matter of black folk, to whom I'm indebted. Does that make sense? And so part of what the Trayvon Martin spectacle and tragedy precipitated in me was a series of reflections about this claim, that perhaps we're living in a moment where the very idea of who we are as a people is fading away. And that part of what the moment requires is a serious reflection about how we will proceed from this moment forward. And so Trayvon Martin verdict, the Zimmerman verdict, occasions for me an opportunity for us to dialogue about a range of issues that confront black communities, a range of issues that confront the nation, because as I've said before, it's dark out here, and people sleepwalking.
Yeah. Professor Glaude, would you tell us, because you're leading us into it, what you see as the three most pressing, I mean, if it's 4, I'll forgive you, if it's 2, I'll forgive you, but I'm just coming up with the numbers arbitrarily. The 3 most pressing issues that you see impacting and facing the African American community now.
It's hard. The 3 that come to mind immediately has to do with persistent long-term unemployment. So joblessness in our community, where you have communities where work has just simply disappeared. That has long-term implications for the stability of neighborhoods, the stability of families, the implications for children. So that's the first one. The second, of course, has to do with education. We need to just be clear. The United States has never committed itself to educating all its children, ever. And disproportionately, that failure has fallen on the backs of black folk, and our children, black and brown folk in particular. So first is long-term unemployment. Second is the failure of public education. What we're seeing right now, particularly in education, is the privatization of this public good. And we need to understand how the charter movement fits in that. 4 out of 5 charters failed within the first 5 years. Some barely squeaked by. So we need to understand the way in which there's an argument being made for public dollars to move into private hands on the backs of how our children are being educated. That's the second thing. And the third thing has to do with criminal mass incarceration, the carceral state, and its implication for Black and brown communities. Right? Because not only are we talking about the disenfranchisement of Black voters, right, in large numbers, we're also talking about the disruption of communities. Right? So when people give you unemployment figures, they're not calculating all those folks who are in jail. When folks are talking, this is not just simply a male problem either. We look at the exponential increase in the incarceration of Black women and its impact on families, children, where are they winding up as folks are being routed into these profit-making industries called prisons. So the short answer would be long-term unemployment, second, crisis in education, third, criminal businesses in the carceral state.
Clinton, would you add to or subtract or agree with Ed's three, or do you have from
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems that we have as people of color in America is not being able to control sort of the message about how we treat one another. A lot of people are very willing to buy into a lot of the negative stereotypes that are created about men and women of color, which is the over-criminalization, the over-sexualization, or the misrepresentation of education that exists. And as I've stated to you before, one of the things that we've got to figure out as our own folk is how we are not going to allow ourselves to buy into that as a way to undermine our own efforts. I've said this before, one of the things that, coming up as a young man in DC and working and trying to find, your way coming of age is that oftentimes I thought the biggest obstacles socially that I ran into were from other brothers that were just a generation above me trying to tell me what I could and could not do based on their perceptions. And that to me is a hurdle that we've got to sort of try to figure out what we're doing for one another and not just whom we're blaming for what we can't do for each other is something that we need to take a very realistic look at in terms of how we interact with one another. And that's something I would implore everybody in this room to make sure that you do. And this leads into other things such as why people profile and all that, but the point is that if we are not as positive for one another as we can be, should be, and want to be, certainly can't expect anybody else to be either.
Thank you so much. Did you have another one?
No.
Do you agree with the three that Eddie raised?
Yeah, I mean, those are endemic problems in American society that I think are, very germane to the discussion, but I mean, I think in terms of what we're going to take away from this room today, which is what I'm going to do my best to try to present ideas-wise. I think that's something to really think about. Is that you don't ever want anybody who's looking for help to feel like they can't get it from you because of something you've done to put space in between you and them.
Angela?
I do agree with the three, but I would also add 48 years ago today, August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law by Lyndon B. Johnson. And the fact that our voting rights are still being challenged and we're still having to fight for them today is a huge problem. I would argue that if we voted in mass and that our rights were protected constitutionally, which is a bill that's been introduced by CPC members for years, Jesse Jackson Jr. before he left Congress, and I think this year is going to be introduced by Keith Ellison. The reason why that's being introduced is because of the 119 democracies that elect their public officials, 108 of them have a constitutional right to vote. We do not have that. And beyond that, the fact that we've had to fight for those rights as Black people, standard ground laws are a result of whether it's inaccessibility to a ballot or lack of understanding of why we need to go to the polls is a major issue. Affirmative action measures in my home state of Washington. There was a ballot measure that came up that was anti-affirmative action called a pro-civil rights ballot. We lost affirmative action. Whether you're looking at economic justice, access to capital, all of these things are things that we can address by going to the polls, by having people that look like us, that are our advocates, that we are electing. And so I think a fundamental right to vote should be added to that list.
Thank you. And Ronald?
So, I've known Professor Glaude since we were teenagers at Morehouse, so I feel it my duty to disagree with everything he just I'm kidding. I think the list is appropriate. I'll expound a bit on the criminal justice element in the following way, very briefly, that by saying that over-policing leads to over-prosecution, which leads to over-sentencing. Part of this narrative we've heard in the wake of Trayvon Martin has been, well, maybe he was profiled, but this is a tax that black men have to bear because they disproportionately commit crime. My words, it's been said on the media much more crudely. But as a factual matter, that's just wrong, right? It's absolutely wrong. And I'll just give you one set of data so you can think about. I think about this claim. So the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics, every year puts out a host of statistics, right? So one stat should be troubling to us, and it's the following, right? That use of drugs in the country. So we know that from the Department of Justice itself that blacks in America on a pro rata basis use drugs less frequently, illegal drugs, less frequently than other communities, including white communities. However, we are policed, prosecuted, and sentenced disproportionate to our population, right? So why is that? Well, when you're over-policed, you're going to be arrested. Now, they get mad at me when I say this in Cambridge, but I'm in Cambridge and say, look, I can go 200 yards behind me to the dormitories of Harvard, and we can find as much drug use as people being arrested every day in Roxbury or Dorchester, which are predominantly black communities in the Boston area, right? But if they're policed in a different way and arrested, then they're prosecuted in a different way. They don't have jobs and so forth. I'm very sorry. They don't have jobs and so forth, and they're sentenced in a different way. It becomes this insidious snowball effect. So yes, I agree with those four areas, and we really have to take a good look at the way in which the state exercises its authority vis-a-vis communities, particularly vis-a-vis communities of color.
Yes, you can. But I
just want to add to that in sort of a real-time practicality sense. Tommy Wells and Mary Berry, who are two council members here in D.C., are currently pushing legislation in order to decriminalize marijuana possession over or under a certain amount. Now, you can look at that and say, sort of obviously on its level, that it sounds like you're trying to let people and various others do drugs. But the reason for it is very simple, is that we're handing out more drug sentences than we are diplomas in the district to young men. And it's saddling their abilities to get educations, it's saddling their abilities to get jobs, and it's saddling their abilities to do other things. So I'm just letting you know that from a practical standpoint, there is a reason. It speaks to the points you're talking about. The over-policing of certain areas, it's just a problem. So when you see that in the news and you look at it for what it is, don't just think of it in one context. There is another side that does have merit.
And you didn't have to rush, because I was about to say that anyone have a response or a reaction or something they want to say based on what Ronald has just told us. So I extend that to other members of the panel. If you want to respond now to something that you've heard from any other panelist, feel free to do so at this point.
Well, I can just continue on that, and I say that because I think the reason why it's important for it to be brought up is because a lot of people don't even bother to think about how much that affects their day-to-day lives and how much that affects their day-to-day thinking on so many on a regular basis. I mean, the reason why you think of anybody as a thug at all has really nothing to do with what you know about that person. If you are in the typical mindset of profiling, it's because of what you believe as a result of statistics that are unfair by definition to a certain part of society. And that's something that when you really peel back the layers and you analyze what are your subconscious biases are very important. And that's not just something that white people do to other races. That is something that a lot of people do to a lot of other people, no matter what they look like. It's a matter of age, it's a matter of socioeconomic position, it's a matter of, again, dress, whatever. That's something that everybody needs to look at themselves and understand that there are people that are inherently unfairly treated that you might not be a part of, even if you look like those people. And that's something to take a real deep thought about when you just see somebody just walking down the street every single day.
Panelists, I have something I need you to help me with. And because it seems so cyclical to me. I remember when we fought against the death penalty. This is 1970. We're in the Supreme Court of the United States trying to get the death penalty abolished. Remember? At that time, the majority, 80% of the men on death row, African American men, were on for rape. And the victim was a white female, alleged victim. So we've always had this disparity when you look at the race of the victim. When we argued McCleskey versus Georgia in the Supreme Court, the whole issue of what was happening with the Georgia prison system and how we would get the race of the victim and determine the punishment of the one accused. Now, one of you just made the point that this is where we are today in terms of the over-policing and who's being picked up, and also race of the victim, matters. Now, voting rights, same thing. Voting rights, same thing. We fought so hard to get the Voting Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson signed it. Then that's how we got it extended for 5 years to 7. Got it extended for 5 more years. Then got it extended for 7 years. Then in '82 we got it extended for 25 years. And in 2006 we got it extended for 25 years. But now it's gone. Now it's gone. What is it we're doing wrong? What is it? Come on. We had 5 whole minutes, so we're coming. So I want the panelists, and I'm remembering, the panelists, I want you to tell me that what do you think we are doing that 25, 40 years later we find ourselves back in the same circumstance that we had a strategic campaign to change.
So I can,
Whoever.
So I'll kick it off briefly, and I'll borrow Sister Coleman's very poignant phrase, striking at the wind. I think part of the difficulty is we should be having these gatherings not after something's happened, but when certain forms of legislation are in place. So Elaine mentioned McCleskey, for example, and very briefly, here's what happens, right? There is data for miles that suggests that there is a disproportionate impact of people of color in the criminal justice system. Our Supreme Court has said we cannot look at global impact. That's unfair. Our Supreme Court has said we have to look at each individual case, not trends and that. We have to look at each individual case, and you have to show intent, specific intent in each individual case in order for there to be a remedy, right? Now, how do people get on the Supreme Court? People get on the Supreme Court as a function of who we vote for president, but not only that, also as a function of who we vote for Senate. Because a nominee can have an easy time or not so easy time or not even be nominated as a function of who's on the Senate. So if you have certain interests in mind, right, then on off-election years, we have to get out of bed. We have to go to the polls. We have to have these gatherings and educate people as to what legislation is afoot. Very briefly, I'll say, I'll go back to Trayvon Martin, stand your ground, right? It's something really out of the wild, wild west, right? It derives from something called the castle doctrine. You've heard of it. A man's home is his castle, right? And courts in Texas started saying that, well, not only can you protect yourself in your home, stand your ground in your home, you can do it out on the streets. Because that's what, I quote, true men would do. Very gendered formulation here. True men wouldn't go away. True men would stand and fight. Right? So people sat here and said, this is a good idea. In 23 states across the country. This is a good idea. Let people go out and shoot each other on the streets. Because that's what true men would do. Right? These are the conversations that we've got to be having prior to incidents that arise or come into being because of the way our laws are set and the way our laws constrain fact finders.
And I think it's a convergence of a couple of things. From Mississippi, it's about to come out. One has to do with the decades of the 80s and 90s. Right? So we have to begin to understand what it means to live in the age of rape. And we're still in it, even with Obama and the White House. What does it mean to live in the age of rape? So 1980 is a fundamental attack on the very conception of the state that the civil rights movement, right, pushed into existence. What happens in 1980? There's a fundamental attack on desegregation of schools. We move from quest for equity to quest for excellence. What happens? We move from having black and white and brown kids living and going to school in the same school district to testing as the way to measure success, right? As opposed to education. And so what have we seen since 1980? A precipitous decline in integrated schools. The South, which was once one of the most integrated spaces for black children to go to school, has now become resegregated. One thing. What happens? Neoliberal conception of the state, changing in the very way in which we conceive of the economy. How do we orient ourselves to the labor market? What is the state's responsibility in terms of ensuring fairness? The state's responsibility, in effect, is to ensure that the market is operating efficiently. Nothing else matters. What else is going on in terms of attack judicially on the infrastructure of the gains of the civil rights movement? What's going on? The judicial activism that's coming out of the University of Chicago. Right? And how it manifests itself. There's a reason why they're not letting them appoint judges of the bench. There's a reason, right? Because it has long-term implications. Long-term implications. So you got the Yates. Now what? And I'm going to be real quick here. Now, in response to this is the DLC. Clinton was his chair. Gore was up in there. And what is the DLC? The DLC is this argument, is this constitution of a group of Democrats who say that the only way we're going to get the White House is that we're going to have to, in some ways, distance ourselves from the base. Who's the base? Labor, black people. These are the predecessors of these blue dog Democrats. Right? It's under Clinton. It's not just a Reagan story. It's under Clinton that we get right. It's under Clinton that we get the crime.
Right. True. Really hate this quote.
Right. And right, what do we see under Clinton? A few Negroes get access. You saw it in Carter too. Few Negroes get access like me. Right? While you see an expansion of those living in the shadows.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Deepening class divide.
Divide.
Where does Obama come from?
Right.
Come on now.
How does he fit in this? Does he change the narrative? Right? So when we begin to talk about what's going on now, that's just a broader story. And then you have to begin to talk about the complicity of the black political class. Right? You have to talk about the complicity of the black political class. Somebody's going to have to write a novel about all King's men.
Whoa. I knew.
Right? And we know somebody's going to try to get coordinated on August 24th. We're not going to let that happen. I'm just going to, that's a story we can talk about off record. Right? So part of what we're seeing is a convergence, right, of a particular mode of governance and the fragmentation
right, of a particular form of black politics. It's happening simultaneously. And it's happening at a time when crisis has completely engulfed the black community. Right? And we don't seem to have a language. Now that sounds a bit abstract, but I'm trying to get at it. I'm trying to get at it. See?
There are a couple things before voting rights, which has not really been covered yet, but our counselor brought it up, and I think it's worth expressing. Not that this was your point, but I think it's very important that we as black people understand that we're not a monolith and we have a variety of roles to play in a variety of spaces. I'm going to continue to reference my immediate past bosses because I don't think, and I know they're not king's men, but they do have a role to play in the political process. And save them, you wouldn't have any advocates in the United States Congress. So I just want to be very careful about drawing that out and teasing that out because it's extremely important. But I also want to touch on this. You said, what are we doing wrong? Yes. And I think it's what we're doing right. If you look no further than 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, you'll see that we did something right. There is the first black president ever. There were people whose shoulders he stood upon, whether it's Jesse Jackson Sr. or other folks who laid the foundation for Barack Obama to run for president and win. That says what we're doing right. As it relates to the Supreme Court of the United States, we have a very activist court right now, and they're not activists in leaning in ways that would benefit Black America, right? We have a court that's very conservative leaning. The president has been able to appoint 2 people. If he has the opportunity to appoint someone else, I hope it's a black woman justice. But maybe it would be Elaine Jones. She's shaking her head no, but maybe we can put some up. But I also think it's important to talk about your point, which was we need to have these conversations before there's a problem. We always rise to the occasion in crisis, but we very rarely rise to the occasion when we know crisis is coming. Oh, yeah. And so we really need to start having not only conversations, because we're also good at dialogue, Sunday dinners, brunch conversations, and everything else, but what are we really going to do that's beyond a protest, that's beyond just pushing our members? Where is our ALEC-like organization? And for those of you that do not know, the American Legislative Exchange Council is not only to blame for the pro-gun lobby stand your ground laws, but they're also to blame for the voter ID laws. This year, when the Supreme Court announced their decision to basically strip voting rights of the very meat, given the fact that Section 4 was completely eliminated, and those protections, therefore, there was no teeth anymore to Section 5, which is the enforcement mechanism in VRA. We now are in a position where the 83 laws that were introduced in 31 states this year, again, voter ID, voter suppression measures, we're asleep because there's not a black man running for president on the ballot this year or next year. So midterms, what are we going to do? We know that these are challenges that we have to face. It's the 48th anniversary of a bill being signed into law. Yes, that is merely window dressing and something for us to be happy about, but what are we going to do to really commemorate that? March on Washington is coming up. And we can honor the legacy of Dr. King and all of the other civil rights leaders by really doing something. So what is it that we're going to do?